The midday sun beat down relentlessly on the small, dusty town, turning the main street into a river of heat and tension. Wooden buildings, worn and sun-bleached, cast thin shadows across the rickety planks of the boardwalk. A low murmur of voices echoed off the walls, punctuated by occasional laughter and the sharp clink of coins. Today was no ordinary day. The entire town seemed drawn to the square, and the air was thick with anticipation, unease, and something darker, a sense of impending judgment. At the center of it all, a raised platform creaked under the weight of human curiosity and cruelty. There stood Clara, a young woman barely 20, her dress tattered but kept as clean as she could manage. She clutched her newborn to her chest, a fragile bundle swaddled in a thin blanket, who slept peacefully, unaware of the life-threatening stakes around them. Clara's eyes, wide and wary, swept the crowd. She had faced hardship before loss, betrayal, hunger, but never humiliation on this scale. Every whisper from the spectators felt like a blade. Every coarse laugh cut deeper. Her heart pounded, not from fear alone, but from a burning determination to survive for her child. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a gravelly voice and a sharp, crooked grin, waved a hand to quiet the restless gathering. "Step right up, step right up. Here we have something special today, one strong young woman, just perfect for any industrious ranch or household, and let's not forget, she comes with a healthy little one." His voice carried across the square, grating and deliberate, and the crowd responded with murmurs, some curious, some greedy, some cruelly amused. Clara's stomach knotted as the first bids were called out. Men farmers, ranchers, and opportunists jostled to get a better look, evaluating her like she was cattle. Some spoke openly about her past, inventing stories or embellishing truths to justify their bids, each word designed to strip away her dignity further. The atmosphere was charged, almost electric, with a sense of lawlessness, a reminder that in this town, money ruled and humanity was optional. Despite the horror of her situation, Clara did not flinch visibly. She held her baby tighter, swaying slightly to soothe the infant, trying to maintain a small illusion of normalcy. The warmth of the sun mingled with the heat of fear, and she could feel every pair of eyes weighing her, judging not just her body but the very essence of her survival. Her mind raced, thinking of ways to endure, escape, or even turn this twisted fate to her advantage. Yet, she knew her options were limited here. In the open square, she was as exposed as anyone could be. Among the crowd, she noticed familiar faces, some indifferent, some outright hostile. The harsh reality was that most of these people had benefited from her misfortune, either directly or indirectly. And yet, there was a strange rhythm to the chaos. The repeated cries of bids, the slap of coins on wooden tables, the murmurs of speculation, and the occasional cheer or boo from the crowd, it was a ritual of power, and she was at its center, powerless to stop it. As the auctioneer raised his hand again, signaling the start of the formal bidding, Clara's gaze drifted toward the fringes of the crowd, searching for any hint of hope, anyone who might intervene. But there was none, only the relentless gaze of those eager to claim her as property, a chilling reminder that in this place, morality was for the weak and courage was rare. The tension grew palpable, the air thick with sweat, dust, and anticipation. In that moment, Clara realized that her survival and her child depended on an act of courage from someone she had yet to meet, someone who could defy the greed and cruelty of the men around her. Clara's eyes flicked over the crowd, yet her mind was elsewhere, pulled back into memories that were both tender and painful. She could feel the baby stir in her arms, a small reminder of hope, and she breathed deeply, forcing herself to focus. The dusty auction square, the sneers and jeers, were all part of a cruel present, but the past, the moments that had led her here, played vividly in her mind, unbidden yet impossible to ignore. She had grown up on a modest farm. the kind where the land was hard, the sun relentless, and love was measured in small gestures rather than grand declarations. Her parents had been kind but bound by necessity, working dawn to dusk just to keep the household fed. They had taught her to be resourceful, to endure hardship with dignity, and above all, to care for those she loved fiercely. Her childhood had been simple, punctuated by the occasional carefree laughter in fields of wheat, the warmth of her mother's hand, the firm but protective embrace of her father. Those memories were precious, now tinged with the bitter knowledge that they had been ripped away too soon. The tragedy had begun when Clara was just 16. A fire, whether accidental or deliberate, she would never know had consumed the farm. By the time help had arrived, everything was gone. Her parents, her home, and her childhood vanished in smoke and ash. Left alone, Clara had wandered from town to town, doing what she could to survive. She had learned quickly which hands to trust and which to fear, which words to speak and which to swallow. Every job, every interaction, every coin earned was a battle, and every night she lay awake wondering if tomorrow would be any better. It was in one of these desperate towns that she met Daniel, a man who had seemed kind, promising a life of safety and companionship. For a brief, shining moment, Clara allowed herself to hope, to believe that perhaps her misfortune had a reprieve. But hope can be dangerous in a world like hers. Daniel had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Clara betrayed and pregnant, carrying with her the tangible proof of both her loss and her courage. Alone, yet again, she had no choice but to continue moving, seeking refuge wherever she could, always guarding her secret and her child. Even in the darkest moments, Clara had learned resilience. She had survived harsh winters, scornful townsfolk, and the gnawing uncertainty of life on the fringes of society. She had learned to read people, to anticipate cruelty, and to respond with quiet strength. It was this strength that now allowed her to stand on the auction platform, her back straight, her voice quiet but steady, even as strangers evaluated her like livestock. Her baby, too, seemed to sense her determination, nestled against her heart, a silent witness to her courage. The auction square felt surreal, as though the world had narrowed into this singular point of judgment. Clara's memories, instead of weakening her, had sharpened her awareness. She remembered the faces of those who had helped her. However, briefly, the kind farmer who offered a loaf of bread, the old widow who gave her a warm coat, and she drew strength from them. And she remembered the faces of those who had betrayed her, the smiles that hid greed, the hands that struck when she was vulnerable. That memory steeled her, readying her for the cruelty she now faced. Her gaze returned to the present. The auctioneer's voice rasped through the dry air, urging the crowd to bid. Each jeer, each coarse laugh, only reminded her why she had to survive. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her child, for the future that no one had the right to steal from them. Clara knew that somehow, someway, an unexpected force or a bold act might change their fate. And somewhere deep in the crowd, she sensed a presence, a shadow of someone who might intervene, someone whose courage might be greater than the greed surrounding them. The town seemed alive with an almost predatory energy, every dusty street and sun-bleached building whispering the rules of survival in a place where power and greed reigned supreme. It wasn't just the auction, it was the way the townsfolk carried themselves, the way they exchanged glances, the subtle hierarchies that dictated who was respected, feared, or ignored. Clara could feel it like a living thing pressing down on her, a weight that had nothing to do with the summer heat. At the top of this uneasy hierarchy were the wealthy ranchers, men who had built their fortunes through hard work or sometimes through ruthless cunning. They were broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, their hands calloused from years of labor. Yet it was their sharp minds and unflinching ambition that earned them their real power. They didn't just own land, they controlled livelihoods, dictated trades, and made laws of their own on the edges of society. Their influence reached even into the auction square, where a single glance or whispered word could sway bids, ruin reputations, or seal a fate before a hammer ever came down. Then there were the corrupt businessmen who thrived on manipulation and the misfortune of others. Their suits were dusty, their smiles practiced, and their words laced with charm that masked self-interest. They watched the auction like hawks, calculating profit, influence, and advantage. To them, Clara wasn't a person. She was a commodity, a chance to expand their wealth, reputation, or standing among the town's elite. Every gesture, every offer they made was a strategic move in an unspoken game of dominance. The auctioneer, though less formally powerful, wielded a different kind of authority. His gavel and voice dictated the rhythm of the square, and his keen eye could read both desperation and opportunity in the crowd. He was a small man with a sharp tongue, capable of stoking the crowd's greed or fear with a few well-chosen words. In this moment he thrived in the chaos, drawing energy from the anticipation and cruelty of the people around him. The auction was not just a transaction. It was a performance, and he was the master of ceremonies. Among them, the opportunists and low-level enforcers prowled. These were the men who thrived on scraps of power, the ones who would cheer the loudest or jeer the cruelest because they had little else to claim in a world dominated by stronger wills. They whispered rumors, shared exaggerated tales of Clara's supposed past, and tried to influence others' perceptions. Their presence amplified the sense of danger, making the auction a true spectacle of human greed and judgment. Clara sensed the subtle alliances forming and dissolving in real time. The wealthy ranchers watched each other cautiously, each calculating whether a bid was worth the cost or whether letting another take the prize might yield greater leverage. The businessmen plotted ways to profit from the chaos, ready to intervene if it benefited them. Even the spectators on the fringes played a part, their whispers and sneers shaping the atmosphere, creating an invisible force field of scrutiny that Clara could feel pressing in from all sides. Every interaction, every glance, every half-smile or frown mattered. The town was a web of dependencies and rivalries, a place where morality was often a hindrance rather than a guide. Clara understood, in the core of her being, that no one here was likely to help her, not truly. Any act of kindness would have a cost, and most of these people were unwilling to pay it. Survival, influence, and greed were the currencies here, and she had none except her own resilience. Yet within this ecosystem of power, there was also a subtle rhythm, a way that even the weak could survive if they understood the rules. Clara had learned to read these patterns, to anticipate movements and reactions, and to protect herself through quiet observation. She understood that the outcome of the auction would not depend solely on the money bid, but on the alliances, rivalries, and secret calculations of those around her. Every shadow in the crowd, every tense murmur, was a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle she had to navigate if she and her child were to survive. As the auctioneer prepared to call for the first real bids, Clara's gaze drifted to the edges of the crowd, hoping for a sign of intervention, of an unexpected force capable of disrupting the delicate, cruel balance of power. Somewhere, she felt, someone watched someone whose presence could change everything, though she could not yet see who it might be. The murmurs in the crowd swelled as a tall figure emerged from the far end of the square. Dust swirled around him, catching the harsh sunlight, and for a moment he seemed almost like a shadow drifting through the chaos. Ethan, the silent rancher, was a man of few words and fewer known connections, yet his reputation preceded him. Stories of his quiet strength and uncanny ability to command respect without raising his voice had circulated for years. Some said he had once taken on a gang of outlaws alone and walked away unharmed. Others whispered that he owned land that stretched beyond the horizon, yet he remained almost invisible in the day-to-day dealings of the town. He moved deliberately, boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. His broad shoulders carried an unspoken weight of authority, and the brim of his weathered hat shaded eyes that had seen more than their share of hardship and human folly. People instinctively gave him room, a subtle acknowledgment that this was a man whose presence demanded attention without needing explanation. Even the auctioneer paused mid-call, casting a brief glance toward the newcomer, a flicker of unease crossing his features. Clara noticed him almost instinctively. Something about his calm, measured entrance cut through the noise, the jeers, and the jeering crowd. For the first time since she had stepped onto the platform, a thread of hope wound its way through the tight coil of fear in her chest. She studied him cautiously, not daring to meet his eyes directly, but sensing an unspoken promise in the set of his jaw and the way he carried himself, a sense that he did not belong to the cruelty surrounding her. The townsfolk, however, were not so easily impressed. Some whispered in disbelief, "That's Ethan? The silent one? He's no trouble. Let him be. Why's he even here?" Their questions were tinged with curiosity, suspicion, and a dash of fear. In a place like this, people were always calculating the potential threat and the advantage of outsiders, and Ethan was a rare anomaly, someone who belonged to no one yet commanded quiet, undeniable authority. He stepped closer to the auction platform, moving past the edges of the crowd without a word. His eyes scanned Clara with careful attention, but there was no pity in them, only a measured recognition of her strength and the injustice she faced. The baby stirred against her chest, sensing perhaps the subtle shift in energy, and she tightened her hold instinctively. The auctioneer, sensing both the curiosity and tension that Ethan's arrival had stirred, tried to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, clearing his throat, "we've got a fine young woman and child here, and it seems we might have a new bidder interested. Step right up, sir." His voice carried a mix of bravado and unease. Ethan's lips remained tight, his expression unreadable. He did not respond immediately, letting the murmurs of the crowd rise and fall around him. There was power in his silence, a subtle assertion that he would act on his own terms, and that made the townsfolk uneasy. People like him were unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous in a place built on rules of greed, influence, and intimidation. Clara's heart beat faster. She did not know this man, but she sensed a quiet promise in his presence. Unlike the others, he did not leer, did not speculate, and did not take her as a commodity. He seemed to recognize her humanity, and perhaps, just perhaps, the potential for justice. For the first time that day, the oppressive weight of the auction square lifted slightly, replaced by a fragile glimmer of hope. Ethan stepped closer still, his boots echoing softly against the wooden planks. The crowd instinctively shifted, creating a small corridor for him, sensing that this man, silent and watchful, was about to upset the delicate and cruel balance of power. And in that moment, the auction square, filled with greed, fear, and anticipation, held its collective breath, waiting to see what the silent rancher would do next. The auctioneer's voice rasped across the square, attempting to regain the momentum that had faltered with Ethan's arrival. "All right, folks, let's get this started. Who'll make the first bid for this fine young woman and her child?" His eyes flicked nervously toward the silent rancher, but Ethan did not respond. The crowd, sensing an opportunity to assert dominance, grew louder, shouting numbers, each bid a calculated attempt to intimidate both Clara and one another. The first bid came from Harlan, a broad-shouldered rancher whose reputation for ruthless dealings was well known. He smirked at the crowd and slapped a handful of coins onto the table. $50, he called, his voice dripping with smug confidence. The audience murmured in approval, some laughing, some nodding, others whispering bets among themselves. Clara felt her stomach twist, the number meaningless to most of these men yet monumental in its implication for her fate. She gritted her teeth and held her child closer, refusing to flinch. Another bid rose almost immediately. Sims, a wiry businessman with sharp eyes and a crooked smile, threw down $70. "She'd be worth more than 50, he sneered. His words were aimed at more than the auctioneer. They were a warning to Harlan, a show of cunning and greed. The crowd's energy escalated, jeers, whistles, and half-laughs mingling with the tension. Every eye was on Clara, every coin a measure of her worth to these men who saw humanity only in profit. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, waiting for the next bid, but the square had grown charged in a different way. Conversations paused mid-whisper, and even the low-level opportunists seemed momentarily unsure. All eyes were drawn to Ethan. The tall, silent man stood at the edge of the square, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a calm intensity that contrasted sharply with the frenzy around him. His presence seemed to slow time. The shouting bids faded into background noise, and a subtle hush fell over the crowd. Whispers began to circulate. Will he bid? The silent rancher? No one dares challenge him. The crowd's mood shifted, curiosity edged with fear, uncertainty blending with excitement. For the first time, the townsfolk felt a loss of control. They had assumed Clara's fate was already sealed, that her worth could be quantified and claimed by the highest bidder. Ethan's arrival introduced an unknown, and unknowns were dangerous. Clara's heart pounded. She did not understand why this man had come, why he had paused at the fringes of the square, or what he intended. But she sensed a change, subtle yet undeniable. The oppressive energy of the auction, the collective judgment, the predatory calculations was no longer absolute. Someone had entered the equation who refused to play by the rules. The auctioneer, sensing both the tension and the potential spectacle, raised his gavel again. Going once, 50, 70. He hesitated, eyes flicking to Ethan, the weight of anticipation hanging over him. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath. Would the silent rancher bid? Would he disrupt the carefully orchestrated theater of greed? The square seemed to contract and expand with each heartbeat, all waiting for the moment that could redefine Clara's destiny. Ethan's hand hovered near his coat pocket, a subtle gesture, but enough to make the onlookers uneasy. His expression was unreadable, calm but determined, a quiet force that could not be ignored. Clara's eyes widened, her pulse quickening with hope and fear. She did not know this man, yet she sensed that if anyone could defy the cruel expectations of this town, it would be him. Then, finally, the hush broke. Ethan's voice, low and measured, cut through the tension like a blade. I bid $100. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the audible gasp of the crowd. All eyes swung toward him. The auctioneer blinked, momentarily speechless. Harlan's jaw tightened, Sim's smile faltered. Never had someone dared bid with such audacity, such confidence, and with an amount far exceeding what anyone expected. In that instant the balance of power shifted, and the auction square, once a theater of cruelty, held its collective, breath waiting to see who would dare challenge the silent rancher next. The stunned silence of the auction square hung heavy in the air, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the dusty streets. Ethan's words had landed like a hammer striking steel. I bid $100. The number was more than anyone had expected, more than most could comprehend, and the shock radiated through the crowd. Some stared at him in disbelief, mouths slightly open, while others clenched their fists, their pride stung by the audacity of this quiet stranger. Harlan, the broad-shouldered rancher who had started the bidding, stepped forward, face flushed with indignation. "You can't do that," he barked. His voice carried both outrage and fear, the latter barely masked. He glared at Ethan, but the silent man did not flinch. There was no hesitation, no wavering. The weight of Ethan's presence alone seemed to push back against the crowd's arrogance, and for a moment, even Harlan's bravado faltered. Sims, the wiry businessman, stepped closer, attempting to assert his influence. "That's not how it works." You don't just throw out a number like that. This auction has rules." His smile was forced, a thin veneer over the unease settling into his chest. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Ethan was not just a bidder, but a force none of them could easily sway. Ethan's eyes swept across the crowd, calm yet commanding. His voice, when he spoke again, was low but carried unmistakable authority. "I make the rules here," he said simply, almost as if stating a fact rather than issuing a challenge. There was no arrogance, no threat, only quiet certainty. It was this certainty that unsettled the men around him. No one was accustomed to being told, even implicitly, that they could not dominate the proceedings. Clara, standing on the platform with her child pressed to her chest, felt a strange mixture of relief and cautious hope. She had watched every cruel gesture, every greedy glance, every calculated bid, and she knew that the odds had always been stacked against her. Yet Ethan's bid was different. It was bold, decisive, and uncompromising. In his presence, the laughter of the crowd seemed hollow, the whispers of schemers fading into insignificance. The auctioneer, trying to regain some semblance of control, lifted his gavel with a shaky hand, going once, going twice. His voice faltered, betraying the tension in the square. Normally, he dictated the pace and outcome, but here, in the presence of Ethan, he seemed merely a spectator to a larger, unstoppable force. Harlan, flushed with anger, made a final attempt to reclaim his dominance. $200. He shouted, slamming coins onto the table. It was a challenge, a test of the silent rancher's resolve. The crowd murmured, some cheering, some jeering, all sensing the brewing confrontation. Yet Ethan did not react with haste. He remained composed, as if the anger and ambition swirling around him were nothing more than background noise. Finally, Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the platform. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and commanding. He placed his hand on the table, flat and unshaking. "300, he said, voice steady, eyes unwavering. A ripple ran through the crowd. $300, a sum that dwarfed the other bids, a sum that no one dared match. The square seemed to contract, the heat of anticipation pressing down on everyone present. The townsfolk's whispers turned to stunned silence. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily paralyzed, gavel suspended mid-air. Ethan's quiet decisiveness, his refusal to be intimidated, and the calm power in his movements made it clear. He was not merely buying a woman and her child, he was asserting a moral authority the town had long forgotten. Clara's heart pounded, and for the first time she dared to hope. Someone had arrived who was willing to act where others only jeered. Someone had come who could challenge the cruelty, the greed, and the corruption that had dominated her life for so long. And in that moment, she understood that her fate and her child's might finally change. The moment Ethan's hand left the table, a ripple of tension spread across the auction square. His bid of $300 had shattered the expectations of every man present. The once confident jeers now faltered, replaced by murmurs of disbelief, suspicion, and anger. The townsfolk felt a shift in the balance of power, a force they had never encountered before, a silent, unyielding authority that refused to bow to greed. Harlan, his pride wounded and his ego bruised, slammed his fists against the table. "This ain't over," he barked, glaring at Ethan. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his eyes burned with a mixture of fury and fear. He had built his reputation on intimidation and dominance, but here was a man who neither flinched nor spoke more than necessary, yet commanded absolute control. Harlan's challenge was more than a bid. It was a threat, an attempt to reclaim the authority he assumed was his by right. Sims, the wiry businessman, stepped forward with a forced smile that did not reach his eyes. "You can't just swoop in and disrupt everything," he sneered. "Rules exist for a reason. If you think you can buy your way out of the consequences, you're sorely mistaken." His words were carefully measured, but they carried the weight of implied threats. Others in the crowd, sensing that Ethan was challenging not only the auction but the town's social order, began whispering among themselves. Some gritted their teeth, others fumed in quiet resentment, and a few glanced nervously around, wondering if backing him was safer than defiance. Clara felt the tension coil tighter around her chest. Her hope, fragile as it was, mingled with fear. Ethan's bid had shifted her fate, but it had also drawn attention that could turn violent. She clutched her child closer, whispering soft reassurances that masked her own anxiety. Every man in that square had a motive, and now that motive included retaliation against the silent stranger who dared to defy them. Harlan's voice cut through the murmurs. "You think you can walk in here and tell us what's right? That money makes you a god?" His words carried the promise of confrontation. Several other men, emboldened by Harlan's anger, began moving closer, their eyes calculating and dangerous. It was clear that some were willing to risk everything to assert dominance, to reclaim control over the auction and over the narrative of power in this town. Ethan's response was quiet but deliberate. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout threats in return. He simply stepped forward slightly, meeting Harlan's glare with calm, uncheckable eyes. The silence was more potent than any outburst. His posture radiated strength, his presence a silent warning that he was prepared for any challenge, whether through words or action. For a moment, the square seemed to hold its breath, the collective anticipation of violence palpable in the heavy air. The auctioneer, sensing the rising danger, tapped his gavel nervously but said nothing. The men surrounding Ethan hesitated, unsure how far to push, while the rest of the crowd instinctively gave him space. Rumors of his past, of his skill with both his hands and his wits, had preceded him, and now they seemed to take tangible form. Those who had sought to intimidate him were confronted with the uncomfortable truth. This was a man whose courage matched the magnitude of his bid. Clara, still holding her child, felt a mixture of relief and awe. Ethan's silence was a shield, a declaration that she was no longer entirely at the mercy of the town's cruelty. Yet she knew the threats were real. The town would not accept this act of defiance easily. Someone would test him. Someone would challenge him. And when they did, the danger would escalate. Ethan's gaze swept the square one final time, taking in the men who might challenge him, the crowd who hung on every movement, and the auctioneer who trembled under the weight of uncertainty. Then, with measured calm, he stepped closer to Clara, as if signaling that she was under his protection, that her fate and her child's was no longer determined by the greed of the town. The tension remained thick, a storm held in check by a single silent force. The town had learned a harsh lesson in audacity, and the air buzzed with the sense that the coming hours would test courage, morality, and the limits of human greed. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she held her child close, the warmth of the baby's body a grounding force amid the chaos of the auction square. Ethan's presence lingered at the edge of her perception like a protective shadow, and for the first time in hours, maybe even days, she allowed herself a fragile breath of relief. The man had paid a price no one else dared, had stared down the greed and cruelty of the town without flinching, and for that she felt gratitude welling up inside her. Yet gratitude was complicated. Clara had survived by trusting no one, by relying solely on her instincts and her resilience. She had learned early that human kindness was often transactional, fleeting, or deceptive. And here was Ethan, a stranger, who had intervened in the most public and dramatic way possible. She could not ignore the questions forming in her mind. Why him? Why now? What did he want in return? Was he truly helping her out of principle, or was there some hidden motive she had yet to uncover? Her eyes followed him as he moved, silent and deliberate, across the platform toward her. Each step was measured, unhurried, and confident, as though he was claiming a place in the world that no one else could dispute. There was power in that silence, a calm assurance that unsettled both the townsfolk and Clara herself. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the caution that survival had drilled into her. Nothing was ever free, and everyone had an agenda. When Ethan finally stopped before her, he offered no grand speech, no explanation, no promises beyond what his actions had already conveyed. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that moment she sensed understanding. He saw her strength, her determination, and the precious vulnerability of her child. But there was also an inscrutable quality in him, a quiet that suggested layers she could not yet read. It both reassured and unnerved her. Clara took a deep breath and forced a small smile, the first she had dared to show that day. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the still tense crowd. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without embellishment. It was enough, his presence, his decisive action, the simple acknowledgment that he recognized her worth, all of it conveyed more than any speech could. Still, suspicion lingered like a shadow. Clara could not ignore the fact that she knew nothing of this man beyond the stories she had heard in passing, the tales of his wealth, his reclusiveness, and his silent justice. There was a careful strategy in his intervention, a deliberate timing that suggested he operated according to a plan she could not yet decipher. Was she a beneficiary of his sense of morality, or was she part of a larger scheme she had no way of anticipating? The questions gnawed at her, even as relief threatened to overwhelm her caution. Despite her wariness, a thread of trust began to weave itself. Ethan's calm, measured approach contrasted starkly with the brash cruelty of the auctioneers and townsfolk. His presence was not just protective, it was principled. He had acted not with showmanship or pride, but with a quiet resolve that suggested he understood justice in a way most of the town could not. Clara, though cautious, found herself drawn to that strength, recognizing in it the possibility of a safer future for herself and her child. As the murmurs of the crowd continued to ebb and flow around them, Clara realized that her feelings toward Ethan were complex, a mixture of gratitude, wariness, and curiosity. He was an unknown variable, a force that had shifted the balance of her world in an instant. She did not know if she could fully trust him yet, but she could not deny that, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was no longer entirely at the mercy of the town's cruelty. Her heart ached with the paradox of hope and caution, but she knew one thing with certainty. Whoever Ethan was, he had changed the course of her life that day. And though she might be wary of him, she also felt that, with him present, perhaps survival and even a chance at a new beginning was possible. The auction square had quieted, but the tension did not dissipate. Harlan and a few other disgruntled townsmen lingered near the edges, their anger barely contained. They had not anticipated being challenged, especially not by a single silent rancher who refused to be intimidated. Their egos wounded, they plotted retaliation, not just to reclaim pride, but to reassert the cruel hierarchy that had long governed their lives. Harlan's hand hovered near the revolver at his hip, a subtle but unmistakable signal of intent. He leaned toward one of the others, murmuring suggestions of intimidation, perhaps even violence. The crowd instinctively recoiled slightly, sensing the danger, though none dared intervene. This was the kind of moment the town thrived on, power tested, morality questioned, and survival dictated by courage or fear. Ethan, however, remained unshaken. He had anticipated resistance, read the currents of anger and greed that now swirled around him, and moved with deliberate calm. There was no bravado, no show of aggression, only presence, measured and unwavering. He had stepped forward for Clara, and he would not allow the town's arrogance to dictate the terms of her freedom. As Harlan approached, spittle flying with fury, Ethan's hand rested near his side, a subtle but deliberate readiness. In a motion so quiet it almost seemed casual, he shifted, positioning himself between Clara and the advancing threat. His eyes locked with Harlan's, and in that gaze there was no doubt. Any act of aggression would be met with swift and uncompromising force. The square seemed to hold its breath. Harlan's bravado wavered for the first time. He knew the stories of Ethan, of how he had faced danger alone, of how he had never backed down when confronted with overwhelming odds. Even the crowd of opportunists and onlookers recognized that this man was not one to be provoked lightly. Their whispers carried a mixture of fear and awe, spreading like wildfire through the assembly. Tension reached its peak as Harlan hesitated, weighing the risks against his wounded pride. Sims, sensing the danger escalating beyond control, stepped back, urging calm with half-hearted gestures. The power dynamics that had ruled the town for years were crumbling in the face of Ethan's silent authority. No one had dared challenge him directly yet, and now the consequences of such a challenge became glaringly clear. Finally, Harlan lowered his hand, muttering a bitter curse under his breath. His eyes darted around, realizing that the crowd's attention had shifted entirely. The balance of fear had changed, and with it, the illusion of control that had allowed him to dominate so many before. The auctioneer, shaking, called the final hammer, acknowledging Ethan's bid with reluctant compliance. Clara, trembling but composed, exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Ethan turned to her then, his expression softening slightly. He gestured subtly, indicating that she and her child were safe. Clara, still clutching her newborn, felt an overwhelming mix of gratitude and awe. This man, who had spoken so little, had done so much. He had not only secured her freedom, but protected her from the looming threats of the town. His silence had been his strength, his calm his weapon, and his actions a declaration of justice no words could match. The crowd slowly dispersed, a mixture of resentment, relief, and reluctant admiration rippling through the townsfolk. Whispers of Ethan's courage and decisiveness spread, planting seeds of respect and fear that would linger long after the dust settled. Clara realized that the town had witnessed something rare that day, a display of true moral courage. Quiet yet unyielding, capable of challenging cruelty and greed in a single decisive act. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the square, Clara finally allowed herself to relax, leaning slightly against Ethan's broad frame. She looked down at her child, safe in her arms, and felt a warmth that had been absent for far too long. In that moment, she knew the world had shifted, not entirely, but enough to offer hope, protection, and a chance at a new beginning. And though she could not yet fully understand the man beside her, she knew one truth with unwavering certainty. Ethan had changed everything, and with him there, the future seemed not just possible, but worth fighting for. The auction square, once a theater of greed and cruelty, now lay quiet, dust settling slowly over the wooden planks. The townsfolk had dispersed, their murmurs and resentments fading into the distance, leaving behind only the lingering impression of a day that had tested courage, morality, and power. Clara stood on the platform, her child snug in her arms, eyes scanning the space that had moments ago felt like a trap of despair. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on her all morning was gone, or at least it had shifted. Ethan remained beside her, silent as ever, a steady presence in a world that had been unpredictable and dangerous. Clara watched him carefully, noticing for the first time the subtle lines in his weathered face. The way his posture suggested not only strength but patience, restraint, and unwavering resolve. He had intervened decisively when it mattered most, yet he had done so without seeking praise or acknowledgement. His silence was not emptiness. It was power, confidence, and protection distilled into action. "Thank you," Clara whispered again, this time with less caution and more conviction. She felt it necessary to acknowledge not only his courage, but the quiet dignity with which he had carried himself. Her gratitude was genuine, heartfelt, and tinged with awe. The baby stirred slightly in her arms, sensing the calm shift in energy around them, and she adjusted the blanket, feeling a small but profound sense of relief. Ethan inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgment that needed no words. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that glance was a quiet promise. "You are safe now." The moment felt weightless and yet monumental. Clara realized that, while she did not know him fully, his past, his motives, or the full extent of his moral code, she could trust the certainty in his actions. Actions, she understood, often spoke louder than words. The town had learned, in its own harsh way, that courage need not be loud to be powerful. Harlan and the other challengers had retreated, their bravado tamed not by argument but by Ethan's unwavering presence. The townsfolk had witnessed a rare lesson, that greed and cruelty could be confronted and that morality, even in silence, could wield authority stronger than threats or intimidation. As Clara stepped down from the platform, feeling the rough wood beneath her boots, she realized she was no longer merely a survivor. She had become a participant in a story that would define her life. Her child, safe and warm, was a symbol of both resilience and hope, and she carried that hope forward with every careful step she took. Ethan walked beside her, not leading, not commanding, simply present, a quiet guardian whose intentions were clear through actions rather than words. Clara felt a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and cautious optimism. Perhaps he would remain a part of her life. Perhaps he would not. But one truth was undeniable. The man beside her had changed the trajectory of her world, and she would always remember the day the silent rancher had paid the price no one else dared. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the town in a warm, golden light, turning the dust into a soft haze that seemed almost magical. Clara inhaled deeply, letting the warmth fill her lungs. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the possibility of a future one in which fear did not dominate her every decision. She could imagine a life beyond the square, beyond the judgment and cruelty of others, a life where her child could grow up with protection, guidance, and perhaps even joy. As they walked toward the edge of the town, Clara glanced at Ethan once more. He did not smile, nor did he speak. Yet there was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition of shared purpose and unspoken respect. She realized that in the weeks and months to come, they would both shape the next chapter of their lives, learning from one another and facing whatever challenges the world dared to throw at them. And with that, the auction square, once a stage of despair, became the backdrop for a new beginning, a place where courage, integrity, and quiet strength had triumphed over cruelty, leaving Clara and her child with the promise of safety, hope, and a future worth fighting for.